Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today it's our pleasure to present the 1932 film, A Farewell to Arms, adapted from the great novel by Ernest Hemingway and directed by Frank Borzaghi. It's also our pleasure to have as guests today three people who know a great deal about this film and about some of the people behind it. Patrick Hemingway, the son of Ernest Hemingway; Maria Cooper, the daughter of Gary Cooper, the star of today's film; and the writer and director John Mulholland, who's recently been working on a documentary about the relationship between Gary Cooper and Ernest Hemingway. Now, take this opportunity to enjoy one of the great works of the early sound period of American cinema, A Farewell to Arms. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see one of the most interesting films from the early sound period of American cinema. We have an extraordinary lineup of guests today, and I want to take this moment to introduce them to you. First of all, it's a pleasure to welcome to City Cinematheque Patrick Hemingway, the son of Ernest Hemingway. Welcome to City Cinematheque, Patrick.
Thank you.
Great. And Maria Cooper Janis, the daughter of Gary Cooper, the star of today's film, a woman known for her work in the visual arts, also as the wife of the distinguished pianist Byron Janis. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you.
And finally, the writer and director, John Mulholland, who's recently been working on a documentary called Cooper and Hemingway, The True Gen, about the relationship between their two fathers. Let's start with this film, John, because you've been looking into these two lives a great deal. What was the reception of this film like, and what did Hemingway think about it, and what did Cooper think about the film?
Well, while the critical reception was very high, Hemingway's reception was the other end of the spectrum. He just, he was deeply offended. He just, in fact, he was frightened that no one would read the book again, because once they've seen this movie, how awful the novel must be. But one thing he did love was Cooper's performance. That is, he was stunned that Cooper managed to capture the shallowness of the Frederick Henry at the beginning and slowly becoming an adult and more mature until the end, when he was a real a man of some depth.
Had the studio checked with him before they cast the picture?
No.
They just did it?
In fact, no studio would buy it. What happened was that it was turned into a play by a fellow named Lawrence Stallings, who had co-written What Price Glory, I think. And it was a flop, but Hollywood being Hollywood, just the idea that it opened in Philadelphia on the road, they went and paid $80,000 for it, when in fact the year before they wouldn't even offer $10,000. So the play ran just for a couple of weeks, but that was all that was necessary.
Did your father ever see the play?
No, I don't believe so. But it's interesting that you say that the performance of Gary Cooper was what struck him. And he didn't get to meet Gary Cooper until, gosh, 10 years later?
Yeah, almost 1940.
Yes, yeah.
How did they actually meet? Because it turned out to be an important friendship from both sides, right?
Yeah, they had Ernest Hemingway throughout the 30s had talked to friends of his saying, this actor Gary Cooper and I have the same approach to our crafts. We're both less is more, minimalism. You've got to lean forward with Cooper. He's not going to just throw it in your face. And he was just impressed to the point that he finally got some mutual friends to call Cooper in California in 1939. And they talked on the phone, and Hemingway said, come on up to Sun Valley. And he said, I'm sorry, I can't make it up. But the next year, Cooper did come up, and they met. And in fact, 24 hours after they met, For Whom the Bell Tolls hadn't been published yet, but Hemingway had a galley proof of it. And he gave it to Cooper and said, I want you to read this. And Cooper read it in one day and said...
It's a long novel, by the way.
Said, if this is ever made into a movie, I want to do it. And Hemingway said, good, because I wrote it for you.
And that's absolutely right. And I didn't realize, of course, that's right, because that was the time when he was finishing From the Bell Tolls and thinking about selling it to the movies. And that was the first real big amount of money that he made at one time, was selling From
It
the
was a
Bell
record,
Tolls.
150,000, yeah,
And he paid something like, I think, 89% of it in income tax.
to taxes, yeah.
But it was heartbreaking to him, because we just thought that, and ever after, when he'd joke about, what did your father do in World War II, he said he paid for it.
Well, what, aside from the fact that your father didn't like Farewell to Arms as a movie, nonetheless, did he have other thoughts about it? I mean, just in terms of the way in which it repositioned him in front of the public.
Well, I think it did. I mean, it was a very fine publicity for him as a writer, and I'm sure it enhanced his dealing ability in selling his work. You know, the price he would get from Scribner's.
Right. Yeah.
A major film. Now a major film, as they say on the jacket. All that was just forming, you know. It wasn't
Right.
so set in stone as it is today. But I think he sensed it was not just that he didn't like this particular film or a lot of films. I think he saw very early on that this was going to change the way the mass of people were entertained. You know, there was going to be no more Dickens lecturing or you know, the tremendous status of writers in the world. That
He
this
had a
was
sense of that at that point.
that this was a change.
And he talked about that with
Oh yes,
you.
oh yes.
That's interesting.
And he was quite merciless. I mean, anything he could do to
To knock it down.
to knock down the movies.
Right, because they were not going to have a neutral effect upon the status
No.
of the author.
Very similar to what photography did to painting. You know, it was really a change, and it is a change. I mean, there'll never be another Tolstoy in the sense of that.
Right, right. Now, Maria, when did you become, you know, aware of your father's relationship with Ernest Hemingway? And by that I mean two things. I mean, either what he thought of the work and the man before he knew him, but also what he thought of him once they'd become acquainted.
It's hard for me to pinpoint because Ernest Papa, as he was called, and my father was Papa, P-O-P-P-A, and Ernest was P-O-P-A. Anyway, it was part of just family conversation and family friendship, and my parents hauled me out of school and took me up to Sun Valley when they'd go up there for, you know, for the skiing or for hunting, and so it you know, I wasn't aware of, you know, who he was. He was just this wonderful big bear of a man, and you know, he taught me how to eat beaver tail, which was the most disgusting thing I have ever tasted in my life.
That was a hard time, yeah.
But it was just that he was a friend.
Right.
And I remember my mother saying how your father lectured her one day very fiercely. She was describing someone as a good friend. And Ernest said, no, you don't say good friend. You're either a friend or you're not a friend. You don't use the word good. And
Well, I think that applies to real person, too.
yeah, yeah, right, exactly.
And it also feeds back into the minimalist. You don't need to say good friend, because if you mean the word friend,
If you mean
using
it,
if you're using it properly, then it's unqualifiable.
Well, it has one special meaning. We're just good friends.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
right. Absolutely.
English is really treacherous. It's a treacherous language.
So did you observe, Maria, did you observe, I mean, you saw them within this family setting. Was there this kind of, how to put it, you know, just ease in their relationship?
Yeah. Capital letter E's.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, yes, very much. No posturing, no who's trying to impress the other person, which the two of them, I think, saw around them people coming and trying to do that to them. But I think that's probably why they just like to get out and go out in the low country.
And there certainly was something that Gary Cooper had the edge on my dad, and that was he really was a Westerner. In fact, he'd almost created the image of a Westerner, and my dad really wasn't. He was from the Middle West, but he wanted to become a Westerner, I think. And so he was always learning from Gary Cooper on that aspect of things, I think. Just what it meant, because Gary Cooper was brought up in, Bozeman and Helena, Montana, and so forth. And he was the real McCoy, and my dad was working at it,
Right. Well, considering that both of them are, are and have become icons of American masculinity.
Yes.
It's a very interesting thing that one can imagine from a certain kind of distance, a kind of competition. Okay. But what's interesting in what you're saying is that was really not the way they viewed it. It was very much one of a kind of sympathy for for the approach of the other, and a kind of ability to communicate in that way.
Well, I think they probably had the sympathy from the creative point of view. Each one respected what the
And they
others
didn't step
needed.
on each other's toes
They didn't
that way.
step on each other's
They
toes.
weren't competitors ever,
No.
in that sense. No.
I don't know, maybe out. How many ducks did you bring down today, Joe?
Well,
But
Cooper was a much better rifle shot. That's what really interested him. He was a rifle shot, and my dad was probably more shotgun oriented. So, yes, I mean, I think that they could both beat each other on,
But that
those
was
two
friendly,
weapons.
and
Yeah,
it was a good.
but the competitive aspect of hunting doesn't come in so much the type of hunting they were enjoying. It isn't like you were shooting skeet for money or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So, John, you've been working on, here you are, Maria and Patrick were saying to me earlier that you can tell them things about the relationship.
You certainly can.
Between their parents. From your point of view, not as a family member, but as a writer and director working on this, what's special about this relationship? Between these two men.
What's special about? Well, there is a public Ernest Hemingway. There's a public Gary Cooper. And when I first got interested in this, the public Hemingway, this brawling, drinking womanizer, and I used to think this image of Gary Cooper as this elegant man. I think, why would he hang around with this guy? Then I think this public image of Cooper, of a man of not particular breadth, nope, there's not too much range to him. I think, why would Ernest Hemingway want to be with him? And you discover these layers beneath that. For instance, Gary Cooper was fascinated by writers, and when he wasn't on the set, he'd go up and hang out in the writers' building at Paramount and just get to know them and find out how they work. So that his other good friends were Irwin Shaw, John O'Hara. Robert Sherwood wrote Abe Lincoln, Illinois for Cooper after knowing him.
Right.
And Cooper said, no, I can't do the show. But Wright is just fascinated. He was fascinated by people that could take nothing and turn it into something.
Right.
And Ernest Hemingway, on the other hand, was fascinated in many ways by Gary Cooper's approach to life. Cooper almost became a mentor to Hemingway on handling crowds, handling celebrity. He once said to Cooper, they were in a crowded bar, what do you do when these people start picking and saying things to you and want to pick a fight? And Cooper said, I turn my back. And Hemingway just stared at him. Was what? And then a friend, Duke McMullen, was telling me in a snug bar up there, they were stopped in there one day after hunting, and some bully started to take off after Hemingway, and Hemingway just turned his back. And and Hemingway had a big back.
Yeah.
And the bully didn't know what to do. And he turned to Duke and said, "The son of a bitch was right."
That's very good.
That's a good story.
Right.
Yeah, About a Farewell to Arms is fascinating. There were two endings to it when they did. There was the tragic ending, and then they had a happy ending. And they shot both, and the idea was to have the happy ending play in rural areas and the sad ending, whereas she lives at the end. And Hemingway got word of this. And he wrote his agent saying, "What the hell is going on?" And then Paramount came out and said, "Well, wait a minute, Ernest Hemingway, we've heard, had 29 different endings in his last chapter." And he said, "Yes, but we only printed one."
Well, a lady wrote him about the happy ending, because he did, the word got around, there must have been some interviews where he said he didn't like the happy ending. He said, "Shame on you, Mr. Hemingway. It was such an improvement on the novel."
Well, nothing better than a Hollywood studio to improve something by committee.
Yeah. See, if there'd been the happy ending, my father couldn't have had that wonderful death scene with her.
Oh, yes, right.
Picking her up.
Yeah, I mean that.
Well, it's a very, you bring up such a fine point, Maria, because again, this period of American film, the early 30s, which for a long time was a bit lost to us because these are all pre-code films. Therefore, when the libraries were sold to television, a lot of the television people said, "Well, don't throw any of those pre-code films because we need stuff that's good for television for all of that." So there's a lot of things happening both in terms of the moral universe of this movie, of how the men are preying upon the nurses, but also the way in which we have the lives of the nurses as well, that for a while would be off base. I mean, it's a whole moral universe. And also, this film is pretty experimental in its uses of sound and image as well. I mean, whether we buy into it and like it or not, the whole use of Wagner at the end of the film, and the reason I think of this is because of the clear coordination of your father's performance,
Yes.
And his sense of movement and the lighting with the music is really something to behold, as they say. And one wants to think about what was really going on, both on the set but also in the scoring, in making sure that the power of his performance at the end is so beautifully coordinated with the movement. When did you become aware, by the way, as a child, of all of these movies your dad made before you were around? I mean, sort of catching up with this sort of thing.
Catching up, I caught up with my father as an actor.
Right.
The first film I ever saw him in, which was The Plainsman.
Okay.
And it was I wasn't permitted to see him in a picture before that. And it was my 7th birthday. We had a birthday party at home, and my parents ran The Plainsman.
Right. Okay.
And that was the beginning that I sort of connected that man up on the screen with the man who was running the little 16mm
right.
projection machine.
Yeah.
So, but I think they were very smart, because it's not heady stuff, but it can be confusing to
Right.
a kid. And the more dramatic scenes where the Indians are lowering him over the bonfire was confusing, to put it mildly.
How did he survive?
How did he survive?
Here's the guy on the bonfire, and here's the guy by the 16mm.
Yeah. Well, it was very upsetting, needless to say.
Right.
And I guess I panicked, and I turned around, and I looked, and he was behind the machine, and he smiled and winked at me. And that sort of clicked reality into place, and then I never had any more trouble.
Okay. So how did this, this was a friendship that lasted a long time.
Till their deaths, they died 7
Yes.
weeks apart.
Right, and was this largely through the Sun Valley connection, or did they see each other around the world? Because these are men who are extraordinarily well-traveled, both for reasons of profession and of curiosity.
Cooper used to pop into Cuba constantly. He'd come spend 3-4 days, leave in Paris. They were together in New York. They were all over. In fact, Hemingway, I think he said once he was only in California 3 times in his life, and once right before he and Martha Gellhorn went over to cover the Sino-Japanese War, stayed with the Coopers in January 1941 for several days. But it was only 3
Do you remember
times.
that at all?
No, unfortunately, I don't.
No. I mean,
That's a long time ago.
yeah. And she was a very little girl.
More.
Yeah. Yeah. No. It's interesting. The sort of curiosity that drove both men about the world. They're so quintessentially American, and yet both of them had so much international curiosity and.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think that Gary Cooper is very interesting in that he really wasn't 100% American. You know, he went to an English public school, and in many ways he translated what was really an English idea of a gentleman into an American version of it, and there was nobody else who did that. I mean,
Right.
The emergence of, you know, the hero of the cowboy film is essentially a very formalized thing, isn't it? I mean,
Well, they had a code,
Yes.
which you could say
and
came from us.
I don't think if Gary Cooper hadn't gone to England and had that experience that he would have been the same. Do you? I think.
No, I think probably not.
I
I think
think-
his mother probably knew what she was doing when she sent him.
Yeah.
She said he was getting too rowdy. He'd been hanging out too much
Right.
with, you know, the guys in Montana and the Indian kids and all of that, which was,
Yeah.
and of course he came back to that because that was
Sure.
really the roots that he loved. But
And this was an experience that a lot of colonial British children had, say,
Yes.
who were raised in India or even in Belize or someplace like that, and then were sent back to boarding school to really become proper Englishmen. But the more I think of Gary Cooper as essentially a very gentlemanly person, isn't it? When
Yeah.
that's the major
Totally,
thing.
totally,
I mean,
totally,
not
yeah.
so much masculine. I mean, he was very masculine, but he was a gentleman. Always a gentleman, don't you? I mean, High Noon is the epitome of that, I think. And I think that did come from the English thing.
well, it's following a code in the film. You know, he could have shot Frank Miller in the back, but he. But does he? No. He calls out and makes Miller turn around.
Right.
So you know it's a very subtle thing, but he's following some inner instinct.
But it's also connected, I think, with a sense of dignity that's assertable in all kinds of circumstances. And to talk about one of your father's concepts, the notion of grace under pressure.
Yes,
that
certainly is.
That circumstances may become extreme, but there's a certain ability to control oneself under those circumstances and to assert a kind of moral face in a world which is crumbling about one, or in particular circumstances. And that's also one of the things I would think that links in a sort of level of style of the way in which you get the Hemingway style of narrating a particular protagonist experience was also characteristic of the kind of persona that inhabits your father's performances, all the way from the Ernest Lubitsch comedies in their own way, to something like High Noon, as well. There's always something. Always something.
You could say that Shaw supposedly in his will left a sum of money to teach the Irish manners, and I think in a sense those two could have collected it for teaching the Americans manners.
Now you think of that.
It's probably been awarded already.
Do you think that because Farewell to Arms came out of your father's personal war, a personal experience, that he felt closer to that, to what Hollywood did to the picture in some way?
Well, I think at the stage that that film was made, it was a very unequal, arts were very unequal. And, as you say, it was one of the first talking movies and so forth, and it just wasn't, I don't think he considered that as a legitimate thing. By the time For Whom the Bell Tolls was written, he could see the possibility. And I think he never quite gave up, even though I said they were antagonistic, he never quite gave up the idea of doing something. You know, he wrote one play.
Right.
And then I think with The Old Man and the Sea, again, he got caught up in it and thought that somehow this would be, you know, something in film that he had left his mark on. But I don't think that at the stage of A Farewell to Arms that he really treated the picture in any serious sense. What he was impressed with was Gary Cooper's performance. That was it.
Right.
And I imagine, wasn't it Manjou who was the third?
Yeah.
That was also, I
Rinaldi.
think, he liked the performance.
Yeah.
That was very well. That was very well done. In
Yeah, Rinaldi, he is good.
He's good as Rinaldi.
Of course, I remember many times through the years, my father would hark back to, oh, to be given good dialogue. Oh, to have a story that is written with the substance of your father's and you know, some others, because that were big gaps in just, you know, I can't say these lines. I just cannot say these lines.
And the whole, I think even today you'll go to films that are using dialogue and you think, well, this is more like a play, you know. So it's true. I mean, if you had to say anything at all, it was nice to be able to have it worthwhile. I remember going to see, the only time I ever saw a film being made in Hollywood, and it was something about indentured servant, you know.
It was the Gary Cooper movie, Unconquered.
Was that it?
Yeah.
And there's one scene where the fellow buys the indentured servant, who's a good-looking lady, and he throws the money down and says, quite a price for a rose of Old Bailey. And I remember sitting there and hearing it said at least 50 times. And I thought, oh, well, that's the way they make movies. They put these little pieces together, you know. Quite a price for a rose of Old Bailey. You know? No, that's not quite right. Let's do it again.
That's going to be our final piece for today because, believe it or not, our 30 minutes have just zipped by. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, I hope you'll get in contact with us. The way to do so these days is, yes, through the website, as it usually is these days. Please contact us at www.cuny.tv. Again, that's www.cuny.tv. You'll find the trail to communicate with us. Patrick, Maria, John, 30 minutes is not enough, but it's what the programming gave us and what we...
Well, you're right. It did go very quickly.
You know, I try to keep my promises.
Yeah, we could have gone on forever.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Thank you at home for joining us, and we hope that you tune into City Cinematheque again when we do our best to find some of the most interesting things in the archives of film history. Thanks for joining us today.